In honor of this holiday weekend, we gathered 4 authors with new books out. Lynne Olson is the author of Last Hope Island. We're also joined by Sally Freeman. Her book is The Jersey Brothers. Both of these books are set in the World War II era. Now we fast forward a little bit to more recent history and welcome New York Times White House correspondent Peter Baker. His new book is Obama, The Call of History, and John Farrell's latest is Nixon, The Life. Sally, let's start with you. Tell us the story of Barton, Bill, and Benny.
Well, this is actually a family story. 3 brothers from New Jersey, my father, Bill, my uncles, Barton and Benny, all naval officers, and when war broke out, they were on 3 different continents. My father set up the White House map room for President Roosevelt. Benny was the gunnery officer on the USS Enterprise, which barely escaped Pearl Harbor. And Barton, whom the older 2 thought that they had arranged to keep out of harm's way, Supply Corps officer, helped him get his commission, had been sent to the Philippines and was wounded and listed as missing. And the story is really about the search by the older 2 for the youngest, although it has many tears. He was sort of a Rudy-like character who sort of an underachiever. Everyone adored him, and they were so worried and fretted, even as he, in prison camp, came into his own and built a role for himself, and he was a moral sort of support beam for all the other ensigns he was imprisoned with.
So now let's go to Europe. In World War II, what is Last Hope Island?
Last Hope Island is England. It's a story that really hasn't been told. It's about England opening its doors to the leaders and the military of 7 occupied countries from Europe after the Germans had conquered them. And it's counter to the prevailing myth that was actually created by Winston Churchill, that England, plucky little England, stood alone. You know, from the middle of 1940, after the German blitzkrieg of Western Europe, until 1941, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were reluctantly catapulted into the war. And that's not true. I make that clear in the book. These Europeans who came there, they escaped. They helped England survive, and then they went on to make enormous contributions to the overall Allied victory.
Jack, everybody these days is saying Richard Nixon, his penchant for secrecy, his populism, and comparing it to Donald Trump. In the Trump campaign, they compared his speech at the convention to Nixon's in '68. Where do you see the similarities and the differences?
There's a great similarity in the investigation and the actual crime. I mean, both the alleged crimes were break-ins at the Democratic National Party headquarters. There's very little comparison, I think, between the 2 individuals. There's a little bit of similarity in listening to Nixon's tapes and reading President Trump's tweets, in that you're seeing sort of the unvarnished presidential id, and future biographers and historians are just going to have, you know, down on their knees praying God thanks every night, because President Trump insists on tweeting at a time when nobody writes letters or keeps diaries anymore. And a slight, very slight comparison in their ability to tap what I call the politics of grievance, which is to look out into their audience and find resentment and actually turn that into votes.
Yeah. Peter, tell me about the 2 different timelines of history. When we do it day to day, of course we get everything right, and it's perfectly in context. But when you write about history, you step back, and the things that everybody was obsessed with were not obsessions, and the things people missed at the time turn out to be the turning points.
Yeah. One of the things I've discovered in writing books about presidents that I actually covered is how little we really understand at the time. We get the biggest part of the story, I think, more or less right. In fact, often I discover that, you know, at the time some spokesperson said, well, your story is totally wrong. We're not fighting about this. And then later you go back to do book research, you realize not only were they fighting about it, they were, you know, dogs and cats. They hated each other.
Lamps were being thrown.
But there's so much more to be discovered about every president. You can go back to Nixon's presidency. You can go back to FDR's presidency. We're still learning new things. Well, we learned new things about George W. Bush, I hope, in Days of Fire. We learned some things about Obama in this book, but they're only first drafts of history, in effect. The great thing about presidents are we continue to rediscover them, reevaluate them, and learn new things.
Sally, I want to talk now about character. What struck me about Bill is in the map room and knows what's coming with his 2 brothers. He knows what they're going to face, and he doesn't tell them he can't do anything about it?
Right.
Wow.
Before every engagement, every lopsided battle where Enterprise went to battle, the ships that had been destroyed at anchor in the fleet, and Enterprise with a sorry band of oilers and, patched together destroyers behind them would go to launch for the Doolittle raid, would head for Midway, would all those hit and run battles early in the war. And Bill knew about every one, and he couldn't warn his brother. And President Roosevelt knew he had two brothers in theater. He asked about them every day. Every time he came to the map room, he would ask. And my father liked to say, even with my Republican background, I can't help but like the guy. And it was war, and you didn't do that. You didn't convey those secrets.
Lynne, you've written about Churchill, but also De Gaulle in this book comes sort of age. Is there something you can put your finger on, either with Churchill or De Gaulle, and say, this is what leaders of men all should have?
They were very different. They hated each other at times. They had the most amazing screaming matches. People were afraid they were going to kill each other, but they were very alike in many ways, and they were true leaders. They knew from childhood that they were going to save their countries. They were absolutely convinced, both of them. In both cases, nobody expected them to. Nobody expected Britain to survive after 1940. Nobody expected France to come back, but those two men were determined that that was going to happen.
Yeah, extraordinary sense of nationalism. Jack, after Nixon, give me your sense, his character was relatively clean going into the presidency. Or do we have that wrong? I mean, I guess what I'm looking for is, where do you put the pin in his development?
So Nixon comes home, he gets elected to the U.S. Congress, and George Marshall goes to Harvard Yard and announces that there's going to be this plan for the Marshall Plan to bring back Europe, to bring back France, so that there is going to be a France. And in Richard Nixon's Southern California district, the right wing hated that. His backers hated that. His mentor writes him a letter saying, "You stay out of this. This is horrible." But Nixon has gone over on a trip to Europe. He has seen the bombed out cities. He's had little German kids come up to him trying to sell their father's war medals to him to get enough money to feed the family. And he comes back and he decides that, what the famous Edmund Burke thing about, do I owe my constituency my judgment, or do I owe them their obedience? And he decides it's judgment. And he campaigns for 9 straight months in his district and transforms it. He doesn't just win re-election on the Republican ticket, he wins the Democratic nomination as well. Amazing, amazing story about Richard Nixon. That's the good side. The bad side is, the day it turns, the day the pin goes in, as you said, John, is the night of 1960, when he believes that the Kennedys have stolen the election from him. And this brings forth this torrent of resentment. And he decides then, and his daughter Julie confirmed to me, that that was the moment when he decided he was not going to be outspent, he was not going to be out-cheated, he was not going to be out-Kennedy'd again, and he would do whatever it takes. Whatever they did, he would match it.
Peter, did you come to an essential understanding after the work you did on President Obama? His character was he was often portrayed as Spock, as kind of aloof.
Right.
You could make the case that President Trump is in a sense an answer to President Obama in the sense that he talked about being a man of action, whereas President Obama said, "I'd like to know about something before I talk about it." Was that his essential character, or there are other people who said, he could do the compulsory acts of schmoozing. It's just the people he was working with didn't want to be schmoozed. So it wasn't that he was incapable, characterologically, it just was the circumstances he was in.
Well, I don't think it's his nature. He's an intellectually driven person. He's not a hail fellow, well-met kind of politician, unlike, say, both George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, who got energy off of other people, who got energy off of crowds, like FDR, clearly. Like Nixon, I think in some ways, Obama had a more reserved personality that wasn't generated by other people. And so he saw a lot of it as fake. He saw the whole media construct that he should be schmoozing with Congress more and having them to the White House to watch the Super Bowl as a fake, nonsensical Washington thing. They're not going to vote for me just because I give them popcorn to watch a movie. And he had a point. I mean, obviously, politicians vote their interests and they vote their constituents often, and even if they do sometimes substitute their own judgment. But I do think that we see through history that personal interactions do matter, and that was something he just didn't buy into, and I think he suffered as a result. There were moments where he could have potentially made a difference had he been more willing to play the game. It wasn't his thing.
Sally, you wrote about your father, who you knew, but then you wrote about as a character, too.
Yes. Yes.
I did a similar thing about my mother and found at the end that I knew the person I wrote about better than the person who I knew as a person.
Absolutely.
Did you find that to be the case?
Absolutely. I mean, there were hints at this. Whenever my father would talk about his time during World War II, his time with Churchill, his time with Roosevelt and in the map room, he became wistful in a way that he wasn't as normally as a person. It was a little bit of a window on the emotional man. He was deeply affected by those 3 years in World War II. And I wanted to know that person. And it was really when my parents had retired to Charlottesville after his long career in Washington, and we were organizing papers, and I found a stack of files, correspondence files, his naval intelligence files, his White House correspondence files, behind a file cabinet, and I found some photographs I had never seen of the three brothers together. And in those files, in one section of them was the beginning of this search for this younger brother, which when he talked about it and became wistful in later conversations, you could tell that this was a deeply emotional passage for him. Whenever we talked about it as children or young adults or full adults, the explanations never squared. We just knew that whatever happened had affected him, and we wanted to know more because otherwise we didn't really see the emotional side of this man. So that is part of what drove me.
Jack, you've written about a lot of big characters. What was it like to have Richard Nixon in your head versus, say, Tip O'Neill or some of the others that you wrote?
Not as bad as expected. I did two liberal heroes. I did Clarence Darrow and Tip O'Neill. In their case, I had to govern my affection. And with Nixon's case, going in, I had to govern my, at least, skepticism. I was struck by the fact that his former aides and the people who knew him were so protective about him. There was this emotional feeling that nobody understood this guy. You need to start off on zero before you go off to right or left. And of course, that's what a good biographer should do. He had a lot of wonderful qualities. There are heart-wrenching moments, in the book, talking about Richard Nixon, the guy. And yet, this awful flaw which ended up bringing the country to what Barry Goldwater said was one of the worst crises in our history. And he should never be forgiven, as Goldwater said. So it's tough to live with anybody for 6 years, but Nixon always kept me on my toes. He was a challenge.
Peter, you've written about Clinton, Bush, Obama. Do you have a theory of the presidency that has emerged?
I had a theory. And it's now been blown to shreds. My theory was that the presidents were more alike than not. That we make them out to be these very different characters because of politics, because of ideology, because of the necessities of political narrative. But in fact, that Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama had much more in common than they would ever want to admit, right? Different people. But the dynamics, the imperatives, the desires and motives were not that different. And then along comes Donald Trump. And I have to say my conception of the presidency has changed entirely. He's so different than those other three that it makes me think that it's not always the same, that there are very vast differences in the nature of people in that office, or at least there is now.
Lynn, reading your book, I mean, the stories of Britain and its reluctance to be tied to Europe, absolutely. I mean, it's happening right now.
Absolutely. And the ironic thing is that thanks to what happened to all these European leaders coming to London, that was the beginning of the European Union. London served as the seedbed of the European Union. If those leaders had not gathered in London, if they had not been forced to work together, to socialize together, to get to know each other, the European Union wouldn't exist today. And the ironic thing is they wanted Britain to lead that drive. They wanted Britain to be the leader of that unification campaign. Winston Churchill and the Brits, because of their insularity, their historical insularity, said no. And as a result, history was changed forever.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for being here. This was a delight. And everybody, I hope you enjoy all of their books.
Thank you.